So good evening and welcome everyone to our second virtual professional development town hall, brought to you through the collaborative efforts of the AAST East and the SCC PDS. Tonight's town hall will be discussing marketing yourself, and topics will include things like how to polish your CV, preparing for the interview process, and how to become the best applicant you can be. We're very lucky to have Dr. Matthew Martin and Dr. Brittany Bankhead-Kendall with us here tonight for this session. My name is Jonathan Meizoso. I'm the current research and education counselor for the AAST Associate Member Council, and I'll be your moderator tonight. We're all very much looking forward to an inspiring and engaging town hall session. Without further ado, let's get started. Tonight's agenda will include both a senior and junior faculty member perspective on marketing yourself, including some insight on first impressions. After that, we'll move to a Q&A session, and during this portion, you'll be able to ask your questions using the chat function, using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen through the virtual platform. I'd like to briefly introduce tonight's speakers. Our first speaker tonight is Dr. Matt Martin. Dr. Martin received his medical degree from the Boston University School of Medicine and went on to complete a general surgery residency at the Madigan Army Medical Center and a trauma and surgical critical care fellowship at LA County. He's currently the trauma research director and medical director of trauma GME at Scripps Mercy Hospital and professor of surgery at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. Dr. Martin is also retired colonel in the Medical Corps of the United States Army. Nationally, he's the vice chair of educational development and MOC for the AAST, vice chair of the Region 9 Committee on Trauma through the American College of Surgeons, and on the board of directors of the National Trauma Institute. He sits on the editorial board of 4 major peer-reviewed journals and has received numerous awards, including the Major John P. Pryor Distinguished Service Award from East, the Order of Military Medical Merit, and several teaching and research awards. Our second speaker, Dr. Brittany Bankhead-Kendall, received her medical degree from the Ross University School of Medicine and graduated from the University of Texas at Austin General Surgery Residency Program. She then went on to complete a surgical critical care fellowship at the Massachusetts General Hospital and is now an assistant professor of surgery at Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center. Nationally, Dr. Bankhead-Kendall is the communications and social media counselor for the AAST Associate Member Council. She's also the editor of the COVID-19 resources page for the AAST and has served on the dissemination team writing group and as the U.S. national lead for the COVID surge group studying outcomes of COVID positive surgical patients. She's also a reviewer for the American Journal of Surgery and Trauma, Surgery, and Acute Care Open. She recently received the annual meeting scholarship from the AAST and has also earned the Inspiration Award from the MGH Partners Wellbeing Council. Recently, she was a finalist in the Massachusetts General Hospital's Stories of the MGH, the COVID-19 Experience. Thanks again to both of our speakers for being with us tonight. Jumping right in, we'll go ahead and kick off our session with Dr. Martin's talk. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay, and I'm going to start sharing mine. All right. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. I really want to thank the AAST and the associate members for the invitation to do this talk. And I think my first recommendation for anybody marketing themselves, this was Jonathan's original slide for me, is let people use 15-year-old pictures of you when you had a tan and about 20 pounds ago. And that would be my concluding message. But Truth in Advertising, I sent him a more up-to-date picture of me with a few more pounds and a lot less hair. These are my disclosures. I'm on the Z-Medic Advisory Board. I have no conflicts related to this presentation. And this is definitely in my opinion. And I think, you know, when you heard one opinion about marketing yourself and jobs, you've heard one opinion. So this certainly won't apply to everybody. My real disclosure is, you know, your definition of success may vary widely. And one of the first things you need to do before you even start thinking about marketing or looking at jobs is figuring out what success is going to look like for you. And there's a very traditional notion of success, especially in academia. But I think now there's a variety of pathways you can pursue, and you really need to have your own definition of success. So we asked Jonathan actually to introduce us with kind of the top 5 or 6 things that he thought would characterize us from kind of our reputation. And then this is what, if I was introducing myself, I would put as my top 5 or 6 things. And it's interesting to do this as an exercise, I think, and compare. And this helps give you a sense of, well, what is your brand or people's sense of you out there compared to what it is of yourself. And sometimes those don't actually mesh, and that's something to work on. So if I had to, say what was my brand or my introduction, first would be an active clinical surgeon with a diverse practice. Second would be my military service, which Jonathan did mention, multiple deployments. Third would be as an academic surgeon with diverse research interests and output. Fourth, teaching faculty mentor, and five would be involvement in local national organizations, which I enjoy greatly. And I'm going to cheat and add six, and definitely not six, should be up at number one, as a husband and a father to twin terrors. And who could resist these two by adding them to the slide? So I think it's important to ask yourself, what would your introduction sound like if somebody who knew you well was introducing you? How about somebody who didn't know you? How about if they had just reviewed your CV or just did an internet search, or had spoken to your peers or your seniors, and probably most importantly, had spoken with some of your juniors, students, or residents? I think you'd get different answers for all of those. And I think that's something to really think about and ask yourself when you're talking about how should I market myself, or what is my current marketing or brand. There's a lot of talk about, are you a triple threat? Are you a quadruple threat, excelling in all these areas? I think this is a quick recipe for burnout. And in the current academia, I just think this is unrealistic. But I think in academics, you really want to focus on, at least one of these as your main focus, but generally you want to focus on at least two. And again, in academics, academics is going to be a big part of that. And then you can focus on clinical or education or administration. But there's very few of us, I think, who can be a true triple or quadruple threat anymore. And this talk is about marketing, and I don't like that term, and I think it brings up images of used car salesmen to me, and I think it's more of what you do every day to do your job well, and the marketing piece will work itself out if you do that. I think if you don't do that, and then you're trying to think about, well, how am I going to market myself when I haven't done all those things, that's where you have a conflict. And I think sometimes this is something we're very bad at, even though the reputation as surgeons is we have giant egos and all we love to do is talk about ourselves. I found that most surgeons, like most physicians, oftentimes have a hard time talking about themselves or advertising themselves or putting themselves out there or nominating themselves for a position. But I think you really have to get more comfortable with that, and really start to advertise for yourself, and that's how you will achieve your goals in advance. And you really need to have an understanding of how things work. And again, I think that was definitely a limitation of mine when I started out. I didn't know how a lot of things worked. Like I wasn't sure how journals worked, or how you got to be a peer reviewer, or how you got to be on the editorial board, or organizations and committees and leadership roles. And just ask. And ask mentors, ask people ask people who are doing those things. And most of you are at centers where you have somebody who you can ask who has some insight. And just demystifying that is the first step towards making some of those strides and advancing. Ask to participate. AAST and East, who are both sponsoring this, both have calls for volunteers, for committee members. You can fill it out, submit it. You will usually get put on at least one committee. And that's the way you start getting a foothold. If one of your goals is, I want to be more involved in academic organizations and maybe become a committee chair or rise up the leadership chain, that's how you start. Similarly, at your home institution or local societies, those are great opportunities early to get some experience leading or participating in these things. And then you can take that into national organizations and ask about the next step and how that works. Like, how do I become an editorial board member? That's a whole process that I had no insight into. And in fact, I was doing a lot of the wrong things, if that's what I wanted, until finally I did ask somebody and they told me how that all works. Same thing with joining committees and being a committee chair. And I have an asterisk there because what you don't want to do is show up on day one as a committee member where you've done nothing and say, hey, how do I become the committee chair? Or I want to be the committee chair next year. You do need to pay your dues and put your time in, but once you have, it's perfectly appropriate to say, hey, I'd be really interested in being the chair of this committee. How does that work? And a lot of times how it works is you voice that and you put the work in, and the committee chair recommends you as the next replacement. I think it's also important to know your stats and your academic stats. For example, these are some of the stats that Journal of Trauma looks at when they're looking at editorial board members. And again, this is something I really didn't know about. I do like here, one of the nice things about having a name like Matthew Martin is they can't even disambiguate which publications are mine. So I guess I'm a black box in that sense. But these are some of the stats that they look at for the Journal of Trauma if you want to be the editorial board. And I think that's important to know so you understand how that process works. I'd recommend all of you, if you have any goals in academia, get a Google Scholar account. It makes it so much easier to track these publications. It'll automatically pull in all your publications and new ones as they come out. It'll give you some of the statistics like an H-index. An H-index, again, is another thing I had never even heard of until the Journal of Trauma said that was one of the criteria for editorial board. So get a Google Scholar account, and that gets you access to all that information, and it tracks it for you. And that's helpful not only for that, it's helpful for academic promotions, whenever anybody asks you to pull a certain publication list, etc. And I think we tend to do a lot of things, or we tend to talk about what we want and how we should get there before we ask the why question. And I think that's probably the most important thing to do before you take any steps with your career or talk about how you're going to market yourself, is first you really need to define the why. And I'd recommend everybody take 18 minutes and watch the Simon Sinek TED Talk on this. It's fantastic. And it's mostly talking about businesses and how they need to establish their why first, but it applies just as well to any of us as individuals, especially looking for an academic career. So I'd recommend you all look at this. And then one of the first things you should do is really think about your why, write out your why, and then the what and the how should follow. And this often starts with a radical self-assessment, and I make this very simple. What are the things that sparks joy, the Marie Kondo, and what are the things that I absolutely dread? And this is one of the things I did when I started looking for my next job out of the military. Was I put a list of what are the things I really like, or I notice when I come in to do, I'm happy, or when I have on the schedule for the day, I dread or do not enjoy. And this was close to my list. I love being an operative surgeon. I love doing MIS. I loved working in a group practice with a lot of close peers. I wanted to have a military affiliation. I like teaching and mentoring, research, civilian professional organizations, and critical care. What are the things I did not like? Administrative work. I cannot stand sitting in administrative meetings. I don't enjoy ground level falls. So I knew I didn't want to go somewhere where 80% of their trauma was ground level falls. And I think these are the things that are important to really look at and be honest with yourself, because, if you violate these, you generally will not be as happy as you could be in your practice or your job or your career. I knew I wasn't, one of my priorities was not chasing RVUs and just looking for the, next higher salary. I did the TMD job for 10 years. But then my decision was that I had done that. I really didn't need that as part of my next step. I had initially started on a program director track and was assistant program director. And then again, going through this process of, well, I really don't enjoy this as much as some of the other things like research and clinical practice. And sometimes it takes a while to get to that. Right. But when you get to that and finally say it out loud of, you know what, I'm just going to change path and I don't want to do that anymore. It actually is, it's like a weight lifts off your shoulders. And my top two factors, when I were looking for a job out of the military, one was the people I was going to work with. I wanted to work with a close team that I enjoyed, and I'd worked in some centers that did not have that. And there's not enough money in the world to pay me to work at a place like that full time. And then the next was my family and where they wanted to be after following me around for 20 years in the military. So those are my two factors, and that's what you have to ask yourself: or what are your top factors, your non-negotiables, and then what are the what are the bonus things, and then what are the things that are absolute negative factors for you. A couple practical tips for marketing. One, this shouldn't be a last minute thing where suddenly you're about to hit the job market and you think, oh my God, now I need to start marketing myself. Again, this should be a process that you've had going on throughout your career. And then the marketing handles itself because, essentially you've done all the things and checked off all the boxes. We're going to do a little CV and internet search review of each other at the end. But obviously your CV is very important. I'm going to talk a little bit about Brittany's at the end. But this is very similar to writing a research manuscript. Your CV should tell your story. And there are some CVs that are just vomiting a bunch of information on the page, and there are some that'll tell a story about you. And you really want to have your CV as something that tells your story and is not just a data emesis sheet. And you want to do this prospectively. It's just like research. You'd rather do a prospective study than retrospective review. Set up computer folders, back them up. I know some people who lost all of their computer files for their CVs, and then try and keep your CV up to date. And you should have a folder for publications, talks, grants, leadership roles. Get all those on your CV immediately. Otherwise you will lose track of them. Doing this retrospectively is a nightmare, and I've had to do this for a couple of things. So really try and keep up on this. It doesn't mean you have to do this every day, but every week or so you should take a look and keep it updated. And not just your CV. We spent a lot of time talking about our CV, but for example, for academic promotions, at least everywhere I've been, you also need to have a teaching portfolio. I didn't realize this until my associate professor packet was due, and putting this together was one of the most painful things of my life because I had not tracked any of this. And then suddenly I had to talk about all the courses, any courses I had led, courses I had participated in, course materials I had written, students or trainees I had advised. And so this is another folder you should have. And every time you do something like this, put it in that folder or start your teaching portfolio with whatever format your local institution requires, and keep that up to date, because I can tell you this was incredibly painful. And this is just the first 2 pages. I also then had to include examples of course curricula and materials I've written or revised. So again, trying to go back and do that retrospectively was a nightmare. So keep that up to date, and that will be a big step towards marketing you. When you're applying for a job, you would not believe how many people will send in a CV and a cover letter, that's 1 or 2 sentences that says, I heard about your job, here's my CV. Your cover letter should explain, why you're interested in that job and why you are the person they should hire for that job. So spend as much time on your cover letter, and again, getting to the why. Why are you the person for that job? What are your unique qualifications, and why should that person who's hiring look at you and interview you? And I'd say you almost never want to cold apply. A personal contact is always better than a fire and forget email saying, here's my application. A personal referral from somebody who knows that person who's hiring is probably the best. So, and trauma is a small community. So in general, you probably know somebody who knows that person, or somebody who knows somebody who knows that person. Reach out to contacts at that location center. It doesn't have to be the person who's doing the hiring. You might have a colleague or a friend or a co-resident or fellow who now is there. Reach out to that person. They can give you a lot of insight. And then best of all is reach out to the person who's actually making the decision. And a lot of times on the submission instructions, it won't go to the person who's making the decision. It'll go to an admin person. So if you find out who that actual decision maker is, it's always good to drop them an email. And I would request say, hey, can we talk on the phone about this? I'm interested. And I think that puts you up on 90% of the applicants right away. Respect their time though, be excited, enthusiastic, but do not harass them. Do not send an email every day or every other day to where they're dreading hearing from you again. Do not be rude to admin staff. I can't tell you how many times the admin person who you love has said, yeah, this person, called and they were very rude to me, and that is it. You will not get looked at. Your resume and your cover letter go in the garbage. Do not be rude to the admin staff. I do get asked a lot about how do I succeed in civilian organizations, journals, etc. And I tell people this is relatively easy, and this is Price's law. And I think anybody who served as a committee chair knows this, that in any group endeavor, 50% of the work will be done by 10% of the people. And if you're a committee chair, a couple people are going to do most of the work, a couple people are going to participate, and then there are also a couple people who will probably never even answer a single email for the entire year. So to be in that top 10%, all you have to do is show up, participate, be reliable, and be enthusiastic. And you are automatically now in the top 10%. That's the secret to success. And then when that committee chair comes time to turn over and they say, oh, who was my person who volunteered and actually did things and came through? Oh, yeah, that's the person who should be the next committee chair. Your online presence. Your online presence now is something you need to consider. And it can vary widely, your Twitter account, your Facebook account, et cetera, from being purely professional to, pablum, somebody who just posts cat photos, to mixes of personal, professional, political, humorous, freewheeling, all the way to unprofessional. And it's important to know, again, what your online presence is and what impression it gives, because that can help or hurt you. Some of you may have seen the stir that this study and another study raised a little while ago, where they looked at social media content. This was for vascular surgeons. There was a previous study for, I think this was for colorectal fellows, and went through their social media and characterized various postings as unprofessional. And these were some of the things that are unprofessional: intoxicated appearance, profanity, censored profanity, holding alcohol, inappropriate attire, a bikini or a suggestive Halloween costume, controversial political or religious comments or controversial social topics, or links to songs or videos that had inappropriate lyric. My opinion is this was absurd. I was very loud about this on social media. This raised quite a stir, but it's important to be aware that, obviously these papers are written and there are people who think like that and who will hold that against you. If that's on your social media and they do a search and see some of that. I disagree with that way of thinking, but it's important that you understand that that is out there and something to consider. And actually that second article was actually retracted after all the uproar it caused. And this was just a umbrella concept that I did for another talk of professionalism, that includes both professional and personal. And the main thing is, I think as a profession, we have to recognize humans wear bathing suits, they drink alcohol, they attend parties, they curse, they listen to music, they love who they love. So I wish none of that ever came into play, other than truly unprofessional behavior. I am a veteran of war on Twitter, at least. I'll say I love Twitter and I hate Twitter. You get zero context or background when you put a tweet out. It's atonal. And sometimes you can almost count down the seconds until somebody takes offense at the most innocuous thing that you put out. This was a tweet put out by probably one of the most positive forces on Twitter, Dr. Glaucomflecken, who's an ophthalmologist who puts out great content. And then this was a reply that was accusing him of racism because of his Twitter picture there, which is not somebody in blackface. It's an ophthalmoscope with a mustache. He made several replies, including this one that was not a white person in blackface. That's an ophthalmoscope. And in fact, if you must know, he's Hispanic. But this actually led to a huge uproar, and he went off Twitter for a period. And even to make it more complicated, it turned out that that woman, Mary Laurie, was actually a male who had created a fake account who was pretending to be his girlfriend, and then they were both attacking him. So just be aware there's a lot of this kind of activity on Twitter, and something you may not want to get caught up in, especially as you're about to apply for a job. And I'm going to skip through this. We're running over time. Do a search of your name and see what's out there. There might be an article like this about a notorious killer, or this clerk in Kentucky. I can assure you, Dr. Elise Salim has not killed anybody. My good friend, Dr. Kim Davis, is not a bigot denying marriage licenses to same-sex couples. But it's important to know if something is out there, under your name or a similar name. All right, we're going to just do a few minutes. Brittany and I exchanged CVs and agreed to do a quick internet search on each other. This is her CV that I took a look at. Uh, I'd be interested to hear how you chose your format. And I know I went through 5 or 6 formats and looked at a couples until I finally chose one. I think her CV was good. It's a pretty standard trainee format, trainee meaning resident or fellow or recent fellow graduate. It really goes through the educational history. One thing I would recommend is, especially now at this stage, is you want to start off with current job and titles. And I know when I get a CV and I'm trying to go through and figure out, well, what are they actually doing now? And trying to look through years and see, well, what is their current position and titles? So I would lead off with that up front. And I take an ATLS approach of list the important things first. So uh, obviously she's very accomplished, more accomplished than I certainly was at that stage of my career. But some of the headers, I would say professional positions, and then here's professional leadership positions, and here's professional contributions, are a little confusing. And I would make the headers a little more clear as to what you're talking about, of some, like professional organizations, local institutional efforts, et cetera, because some of these seem to overlap and were a little confusing. But again, this is an issue because she has so many things on her CV and is so accomplished. Honors, uh, critical to list your honors. And again, this is something we tend not to like to do. We feel like it's tooting our own horn. Teaching awards, especially, list them. Uh, if you've mentored residents or trainees and they've won a research award at a meeting, that should go on your CV too, as that research award, and you were the mentor for that project. So again, list all those honors, even though a lot of times we don't like to do that. Um, she has a long list of presentations. I would just flip those again with the ATLS approach. I would start off with the national ones, which are going to be more impressive to anybody looking at it, and then end with the regional and local ones. This gets a big thumbs up, a list of trainees you've mentored. I still don't have this on my CV. And again, that was required on my professor applications, and going back and trying to figure that out was a nightmare. So I would do this, and I still need to add this to my CV. And then again, your publications and case reports are obviously going to be a big part of your currency in academia. One thing I love this, of bolding your name so that people don't have to hunt out and see where you are in each publication. I would move it up earlier to the CV. In yours, it's after presentations. And again, I think the publications are probably more important. So I would put them up earlier. I like to order the listing of pubs again in the order of importance. So people are going to want to see your first author publications and second author, and then senior author, and then everything else after that. But again, that's just personal preference. And then I would add a couple additional sections like in print publications, and that also helps you keep track of them, because you'll always get an email when it's accepted. You often won't get one when it's published. A quick Google Scholar search. Again, she's very accomplished, has multiple publications. It's good not to have a common name like mine. This is what pulls up when you search my name for publications. I have nothing to do with sea surface temperatures. Google image search. These are all her, which is a good thing. It's actually a red flag if you do a Google image search on somebody who's at this stage of their career and you can't find a single image of them. If they've been through a residency and fellowship and are faculty somewhere, they should have Google images. And if they don't, that should raise a bit of a red flag. The only complaint about hers is her program director said he wanted pictures of him along with her on her profile. And then we're not going to even get into the questionable taste in footwear. Also do a Google News search. A lot of people forget to do that, and look for any news stories again, and especially if there's any news stories under its name similar to yours that could look bad, or if there's something about you that might look bad to a prospective employer. Look at your rating from the various services like health grades. And obviously you just came out of fellowship, you don't have any ratings, but this would be important. If your goal is to build a clinical practice, you would want to have some ratings on here. And that might be something, even as you see patients, of saying, hey, would you mind, giving me a rating on this service? Because you want to build up your clinical profile if that's your priority. And on Twitter review, I'd say you get an A+. She's generally clinical and educational postings, and then family and advocacy, very positive, much better than my Twitter profile. Although, she has posted this, and I'm waiting for, them to reply with alerting Child Protective Services, allowing children to drive. a political post, oh my God, this would be unprofessional according to one of those articles. Outing your child for their meltdown after not wanting fish sticks. And then obviously there was the recent debacle with the board exam and the technical failure. And again, this is something, that some people would say, oh, you shouldn't be posting criticizing the American Board of Surgery and the leadership. But I would actually say, of the posts that were made about this, these were actually incredibly professional and positive, where there were some others who were posting things that were just piling on and accusing them, of all kinds of nefarious means. But just realize different people will look at those differently. So my final verdict would be you'd be hired without reservation. And I will finish there. I think I'm a little over time, and I will turn it over to Dr. Bankhead-Kendall.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Jonathan, this isn't working. I might have to send it to you.
Bria should have a copy. Bria, can you load it up for her?
No, I don't think it does. Let me send it now.
Thank you.
Hold and pause. Sorry.
Well, there's a couple questions. Do you want to take those while we're waiting?
Yeah, let's go ahead and get started. We have our immediate past president of East, Dr. Elliot Hott, is asking, should you always say yes or say no? I've heard suggestions on both sides, presumably talking about different professional opportunities.
Yeah, I'll take that. And I had to cut some slides, and I had a slide that was labeled bad advice. And there was a Twitter posting, saying, you should just say no. And they had an algorithm of somebody asks you to do something. Do you have enough time? If yes, the box said, no, you really don't, say no. And if you don't, say no. So it's essentially saying, say no to everything. I think that's horrible advice for somebody beginning their career. And again, the way you establish credibility and reliability is you step up and volunteer to do some things or ask to do some things, and then you follow through on them. And that's how you start building that academic credibility and record of achievement. That calculus changes as you go on through your career, and you get busier and busier, and then you have to selectively say no to things. I also think it depends who's asking too. Like again, if Kenji Inaba or Elise Salim or even Elliot Hout comes to me and says, hey, would you do this? My answer is always going to be yes. I don't care how busy I am. But I think that say no to everything is horrible advice. Saying yes to everything, even low value things, also will just get you overwhelmed and you won't get anything accomplished. Like if somebody says to you, hey, I want you to write 3 case reports, whereas you could actually do a real research study and get a good publication. I'd say, well, no to the case reports. Let's focus on the higher yield thing.
All right, great. Next question is, how much do you think this new concept of social media presence, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, etc., is or will be to our marketability? Do we think it's helpful or just weightless fodder?
Hey, how about Brittany might be better to answer that?
Well, in the meantime, then we'll answer Dr. Hout's next question, which was, did Matt Martin really say to break out peer-reviewed by first author and then second author? I've never seen anything except by date.
Yes. And again, that's personal preference, but when I'm looking at a CV, and especially if I'm looking at somebody who I'm looking at them or hiring them to contribute to the research program, I don't want to go through a random list of they were first author here and then they were 7th author. I want to see first author publications and how many they've had in the timeline, and are they still publishing? How many senior author publications? And I think those are the things that get you more credit academically. And then after that can be the, where you're a middle author somewhere. But again, that's my preference. Doing it strictly by timeline is fine. But I like organizing it that way, and that's definitely how I like reviewing somebody's CV. And especially if I'm looking at them focused on, is this person going to be a productive researcher, and what have they done so far to this point?
Great. Brittany, you think you're up
All
and running?
right. I think so. Let me try this out.
Yeah, we can see your slides.
Yeah, let me actually try sharing from my screen that way. There we go. Can you see that?
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. All right. So thank you, Dr. Martin, so much for being here with us. We reached out to him a little bit last minute and he agreed to be here, and we are super, super grateful to have his insight and thoughts. So I will be the junior faculty speaking tonight. And I'm really excited to be here and to participate. Again, like Dr. Martin was saying, we had Jonathan give us an introduction, but then try to think about what it would be that we would want to be introduced about ourselves. And so I kind of thought about my own brand and marketing myself, and I really hadn't thought about that before this time. Maybe subconsciously I had, but it was a good exercise and a good practice to think about what it is that I want to emanate, and what is it about me that makes me and makes me different and unique, which I'll kind of get into later on. And kind of like he talked about being a dad to twin terrors, I am a mom first and foremost. That's who I am, who I will be, and it's ingrained in everything that I do. And there was a point in training, especially early on, where I wasn't okay talking about that. I felt like it had to be a secret. I felt like it had to be this part of me that I didn't really talk about. But now because of those women before me who have made that a big part of who they are and what they do, I feel really comfortable saying that as well. My chief grand rounds that I gave at UT Austin was entitled From IMG to Ivy League. And I kind of talked about my unique experience with my surgical education. And I think that's another big part of the fabric that I've woven through my career thus far, and that is starting as a Caribbean medical student on a small island where Pirates of the Caribbean was filmed, and working my way up to do fellowship at the end at one of the best hospitals on the planet, which is pretty exciting and gives me a lot of experience that maybe a lot of other people haven't had necessarily. Through that, I have learned grit and resilience. Maybe I owned a little bit of that, but I also honed a lot of that, and I learned a lot of it too, which is a lot of who I am. And I would be remiss to not talk about COVID, and that I am very early on in my faculty years. Obviously, I'm like 3 months into being faculty, but it has been a big part of my life and my career thus far. This picture was taken on my first day of fellowship. So what would have been my last year, my son made me a little first day of school sign. And I thought I was going to be doing a surgical critical care fellowship in Boston, but it really ended up being half of a surgical critical care fellowship and half of just a purely COVID fellowship in one of the nation's worst surging cities when we knew nothing about COVID. So that is a lot of who I am, and it separated me from my children for months, and it made me rewrite my will, and it made me scared to go to sleep at night, and nervous to go into work. And so I had to really use that grit and resilience to get through that. But through that and looking at the silver linings, like I've done over the years, I have found these global collaborations, which have sparked so much academic proliferations and all of these collaborations that have been super exciting and a really fun thing to be a part of. So I think that's been a big part of who I am and what I've learned and what I'm interested in as well. So some of my disclosure slides here. I am not a marketing major, and I am definitely not an expert at being faculty or at marketing, both. but I have been through this process really recently. And I think I have a really fresh perspective from an applicant point of view, and in this weird virtual time of Zoom as well, to have been going through all of this. And I did a little bit of expert crowdsourcing, which I hope you will find to be rewarding. So a little bit starting off with marketing and looking at branding. I think all of us can look at this page and these emblems and these signs and symbols, and immediately it gives you a feeling, or it makes you think about something, or a memory, or it makes you want something. And that's marketing and people who do a good job at marketing. So I think in translating that to us as surgeons, how does that translate at all to surgeons? It doesn't seem like it would. But I think if you look at this group of people here who I highly, highly respect, I know all of these people by what they've done over the years and the values that they have and the things that they find important and what type of speakers that they are and what type of research that they do. I know all of those things just by the last couple of years in academia. So I think that it does translate to surgeons. And I know that if my institution were to hire Dr. Clay Berlew, I think I would know what we were getting. And if we were to go out and ask Dr. David Spain to talk about a certain topic on leadership, I would know what it was that we were getting. And I think that's important for all of us to think about as we go to market ourselves and to look at ourselves over the next few years in finding a job. So when you do a quick Google search about marketing, it gives you all these like 7 Ps and 5 Ps and whatever. But really what I kind of started to notice was that it boiled down to these two different things of being needed, you, the product, the brand, or you need me. And from that being needed part, it is what void do you fill for the customer? And in this case, our employer, or what do I provide for you that you really can't live without? And so in thinking about this more on the being needed side, I went to the marketing firm that that works with Panera. They represent Panera and they have for a long time. And I talked to Allison, one of their marketing specialists who works with Panera and has for a long time. And I asked her what it was that kept Panera around as one of their customers. What were they doing as a marketing firm to keep them coming back and not leaving? And so as I talk about these things, again, try to think about it not from a corporate standpoint, but think about it from you as an individual and setting out on this search for a new job and what you're going to bring to the table, and maybe think about how these would apply to you. So she said, we're always collaborating. Anytime that Panera is sending us anything, we are always timely and we are always effective. Even when it's a last minute pop-up campaign and it's Thursday afternoon and they want a Friday special coffee deal, we are always talking about what can we do to make it happen. And even if we have to be creative, we don't want to kill ourselves working, but what can we do to make it happen and be make it happen people? She said that they know Panera better than they know themselves. So they know that company better than the company knows the company. She said, we make ourselves sticky, i.e. harder for them to break away from us. That when they want something that doesn't really make sense, they use strategic planning, which I think every intern and junior resident has done before, of this might not work, but what about this instead? And she said they use new innovative solutions and they're always trying to think of things that Panera couldn't live without, and that if they left us, they wouldn't have it anymore. So they stay around. So in thinking about this more, then you start to translate this to you yourself as a person and not to these big marketing firms. And I asked her, what can we as people, as our own brand of ourselves, what can we do for ourselves? Again, we're all kind of taught as we go up through residency and we talk with our mentors and how do I present myself? And you might talk about it before a case or after a case or as you're talking about fellowship, but from a marketing expert, what would they say? And she says you want to have your 5-minute elevator speech, which I know I've been told before as a resident. So it's interesting to hear that from a marketing who does that for a living too. She said you want to talk about your strong points and your main accomplishments. You want it to be personalized and not cookie cutter. And you want to throw in stories that are interesting to help you connect with the person that you're talking to. She also talked about staying relevant, which again, I thought really translated well. I think that's easy to do in residency and fellowship. We're constantly sitting in M&M and didactics, but it's important because I know there will be some new faculty like myself here that we want to remember to continue to do that post-training, especially if we're not in an academic institution, and to connect with others who can facilitate people finding and connecting with you. And like Dr. Martin talked about, doing that in organizations, whether those are national or local, and getting involved in those committees early on and being a real part of that committee and not just a name on an Excel spreadsheet. And then networking. She said it's much easier to get a job through connections than in passing over your resume. Often, and I really identified with this because we all come out of training with essentially the same diploma, saying that we can do general surgery. She said, often there's a lot of people who will have your same skill set, but the more you get out there and meet people in your field, the easier it is to make that association of you with the potential job. So again, kind of moving on with this, I talked to another marketing specialist who makes jewelry, luxury jewelry in New York. And clearly there's already a large luxury jewelry market in New York. And how did they really evolve and find a place, a niche for themselves in what was already kind of a saturated market? And she said, you really have to craft your message and how do you want people to experience you? Tell the story of your work. And I think that's kind of hard to do. Like we've talked about it, it's not exactly innate to us because we've spent so many years training and learning and being in the operating room and honestly becoming kind of weird versions of ourselves because of what training does to us. So what if you don't necessarily know? You've gotten to the end of training and you're not necessarily sure what that means. So she pointed me to this marketing firm, and I'll list the name here at the end. But this firm goes around the country to different colleges, and they talk to students about knowing what your it factor is. And when describing this it factor, they say that it is the powerful, unmistakable, and quick thing that makes you stand out. It's what draws us like a magnet to the most dynamic personalities, brands, leaders, and ideas. You identify, cultivate, and effectively communicate that to form a memorable impression. And all that sounds like a lot of like fluffy words and whatever, that doesn't really make sense. But I think this is really what the crux of it is. What makes you stand out? For some, it's life experience. For some, it's passion. For some, it's your goals. And so I know as a surgeon, I need quantitative, objective things to wrap my mind around and to think about and to at least put ideas in buckets of. And I think if I was having a hard time coming up with that it factor, or what is it that I want? What is it that I want people to know about me? I think that looking at this, is it life experience? Is it a passion of mine? Is it my goals? Using that as a jumping off point might really be of help and of benefit to you. And if you want to listen to a really cool podcast, that is the link to it there at the bottom through that marketing and public relations firm. That's really good, I think. So then a little bit of specifics then, talking about you as a person and who you want to be as a brand and marketing. So now on to polishing your CV. So to polish a CV, you have to have an up-to-date CV, like Dr. Martin was talking about. And some of the tips that I heard on keeping them up-to-date, because it was very easy to do as a medical student and an intern. But then if you're prolific and if you do things and if you're on committees, it starts to really add up and you're not only busy, but then you're doing more and more things and it can get away from you. So one of the things I heard from one of my mentors, Dr. Brown, was to do it on the plane ride. So whenever you go to a conference, whenever that happens again, you want to open your laptop and the first thing you do whenever you're taking off is update your CV. And I think that works really well. Another idea I've heard is to do it once a week, to set aside time, maybe on a Friday morning every week to update it. That wouldn't work for me, but it might work for some people. And then another thing that I did, especially in fellowship and when I was really busy in training, is most things come via email, whether that is you've been added to this committee or we're asking you to do this interview or your publication has been accepted. And so if I don't have time, I will just copy the one-liner, Control-C from the email, and I will throw it on the Word document that I leave on the side, and I'll just leave it there, and that'll at least remind me that it's there and I can officially go in and put it in later. So if that helps you, that might also help you keep things up to date. As far as formatting, and again, like Dr. Martin said, everything's a little bit different. When I went from UT in residency and I went to Mass Gen for fellowship, they wanted everything in Harvard Medical School format, and I had to change my entire CV for the 1 year that I was there, which was super painful. And so that is why it is the way that it is now, because that was so intricate and detailed and it didn't really make a lot of sense to my mind. So that's how my CV evolved to the way that it is now. And I'm definitely going to take a lot of Dr. Martin's critiques to heart and go and finish my own CV after this. But they are all really different, and especially institutions can vary widely. So be aware of that and know that that is a thing. I like to send my CV to a non-medical person to review grammar and punctuation. They don't get caught up in the weeds of all of the academic things, and they just purely look at those things. So I think that's helpful. You want to make sure you're uniform and consistent with your formatting and you're not tabbing in weird places. Also, not one size fits all. Again, talking about different institutions, subdividing. If you're a medical student and you only have one academic presentation, you're not going to have regional, national, international. It's going to look silly if you just leave things as none. So keep that in mind, that that's going to evolve and vary. And then something that I like to do is save my CV as a PDF. So I always keep a working Word document, but before I send it to someone, I save it as a PDF. I pull it up. I make sure none of the formatting's gotten weird, because I find that sending it out, people's browsers can vary and things can vary, and Word version this or that, it can be weird. So I like to save it as a PDF so that it will be uniform no matter what. The other thing that I was told, and is good advice, is taking off the long time ago stuff unless it's exceedingly significant. And that changes over the years. So my medical mission trip that I did in college and all of the 23 different things that I did, maybe it mattered applying for residency, but it probably isn't going to matter a lot now, except for the one-liner that I did it. Or maybe it does, depending on what you're going into. So just consider that and keep that in mind. Keep track of everything that you're spending time on. That all deserves to be accounted for. So keeping track of your mentees that you're spending time with, and keeping track of the formal education that you're providing as well. I like to include hobbies or outside interests just as a 1 or 2-liner. Whenever we were interviewing as chiefs for our new incoming intern class, we learned a lot about our incoming intern class, and it was really neat. But that's a stylistic thing. And I think for me, it was important to learn that the old adage, if you can be asked about anything on your CV, remember that is still important. But as you're job interviewing, it's going to become more about what are you looking for and having the CV to back it up, instead of quizzing you about, well, what did this molecular whatever show and what did this research thing show? I think that mentality switches a little bit. So preparing for the interview process itself, we've all been through the process for med school, residency, fellowship, but this is different now, and you're the one calling the shots. This is what you've been training for, and you should be looking for the job that is the right fit. Now, I say right fit, like Dr. Martin talked about, but that is different from saying the perfect fit or the dream fit. So if you ask anyone, well, what kind of job are you looking for? It would be, oh, the dream job. They have this, 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 this. These are all the things that I want. And I think you have to be careful about that, because a dream job is just like a dream house. And if you've ever tried to build a dream house, you would know that that does not exist, that there is always going to be pitfalls within that. It might be that it costs too much money. It might be that the bank doesn't give that kind of a loan. It might be that you could have the dream house built, but the plot of land that you're needing is not exactly right. It could be that you're working with the architect and this room isn't going to be able to format just this way with the stairs that you're wanting. It could be that town hall and city ordinance doesn't allow for that kind of staircase to work, or that your builder doesn't feel comfortable building that kind of a second story, that the timeline doesn't work, that the type of tile that you're wanting is on back order. So just because you're wanting this dream house doesn't mean that you can really still get all of these dream things. And I think that's important to remember with the job that you're wanting. And some of the things to consider, like Dr. Martin listed off his joys and no joys. Salary is one thing among many things. Employee benefits, PTO, retirement, time for research, or not having to do research. If you're not interested in an academic career and you don't want to do research, that's also important to know if research is going to be expected of you. Being able to attend conferences and have that time off versus being asked to use your own time to take off for those. The geography and where it's located, your academic proliferation and how quickly you can move up the ranks in academia if that's important to you. How clinically busy you are is really important to consider. The adjuncts that they give you, things like a secretary and a coordinator, I didn't never know was really going to be important, but my coordinator here has like changed my life. So that's something I highly value now. Your partners is really, really important, as is this image says workplace culture, because it's really hard to find a picture that describes workplace culture, but we all know that it's one of the most important things in looking for a new job. So I think looking for a job with the least amount of manipulating square pegged round hole possible, and defining your negotiables and defining your non-negotiables, your joy and your not joy, and making sure that they align with the job that's being offered. So also, I think, really important to talk about the interview process. And again, just preparing for the interview process, our next town halls will look into that more about the actual interview process. But who better to ask about an interview process than someone who does interviews for a living? And so I talked to my friend, Vanessa Welch. She's on Boston 25, and she does this every day, all day. And I asked her specifics about preparing for interviews, and especially in the time of Zoom and everything being virtual. She said, first of all, make sure your computer works, which is hilarious that I totally messed that up, and has a good camera. She also recommended cleaning the camera beforehand and removing smudges and tilting the camera downward. She reminded you to set up in a spot with good natural light or buy a cheap clip-on light from Amazon. She said, ensure your background is professional and you may need to be creative. So if you have kids, you might want to lock the doors at home or schedule the interview during nap time. Is your home a mess? Turn the computer the other way. If your internet isn't great, thinking about a hospital meeting room or maybe asking to use a faculty office. Practice using your platform prior to the interview date. Be sure to know how to navigate, screen share, all of those nuances before starting. Clothing, she said that plain prints are less distracting than patterns, which I think we all kind of know, to look into the camera while speaking instead of down at the screen. And that preparation is key, which I think we all know. We've all learned this. Know facts about the department, the city, weave it in and show that you've done your homework and have a vested interest in this place that you're looking to interview. And think of possible questions just like we did for residency, and practice answering with a friend, and make sure that you have your own questions for the interviewer. And again, this isn't residency anymore. You don't have to have a list defined and just spurt them out. It should be true, honest questions about those negotiables and those non-negotiables and about culture, because this is where you're going to be setting up for a long time. And most importantly, she said, remember to be yourself. The last couple of things I was going to add to this was I've started turning my phone either on airplane mode or off, and X out of all other screens to avoid email pings or accidental pop-ups. And then finally, that things happen virtual or real life, and roll with it. And where screen outages and screen sharing are the now, before it was car accidents and traffic and all the things happen. And remember that your employer is watching, or your future employer is watching, and how you handle these things is going to translate to how you're handling things in the office and in the future. And so take everything with a grain of salt and be professional all the time. And I did not prepare anything about Dr. Martin's CV because it is like 67 pages of perfection and greatness. I will say that in reading Dr. Martin's CV, I realized how much work I have to do and how much further I have to go. But also I realized that as junior faculty, I really picked out mostly the topics that he did and the people that he worked with. And those were the things that stood out to me the most. And I think you invest your time in what is important to you. And so I think that I can get a pretty quick sense of what is important to him, even though I couldn't possibly list as many achievements as he has. I think that's really important and something good to look at in my own CV, and remembering that. And then his social media profile is full of sarcasm and why ? In terms of clinical decision making, which I appreciate, and I think we all do. But it's good. I like it. I have nothing bad to say. I'm too smart and too early in my career to say much more than that.
That's an excellent point, Dr. Bankhead-Kendall. That's a good strategy to take. Thank you both for really excellent talks. So we're actually a little behind time, but I'm going to go ahead and keep pushing on with some of the questions and answers. We'll keep going for a little bit, and all of this will be recorded so that you can refer back to them later on. So I'm going to take a couple of the questions from the audience. One that we deferred to Dr. Bankhead-Kendall was, how much do you think this new concept of social media presence, whether it be on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, is or will be to our marketability? Is it helpful? Is it just weightless fodder?
I think it's like anything in life. I think it can go both ways. I think you wouldn't be behind at all to not have a social media presence, to completely be void of Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or anything. I don't think that's a bad thing, and it'll keep you out of trouble. You can't get into trouble. But I think there's also a lot of good to be had. I've learned a lot clinically, and like this COVID surge thing that I was able to become a part of was all via Twitter. And that has led to my CV exploding with publications and meeting all these people across the globe and writing all of these really cool guidelines for global surgery in COVID times. I mean, it can be a good thing. So if you're wanting the network possibilities and to learn some stuff from people who aren't at your institution, I think you should go for it. And you can always be kind of quiet. You don't have to post things or put things out there. But it's worth kind of dipping your toe in, even if you haven't tried. But you're not going to lose anything by not being out there, I think.
Excellent. Dr. Martin, anything to add to that?
No, I think that's right. You can, there's a whole group of colleagues I have now that are just through Twitter. And, then we'll finally run into each other at a meeting and be like, oh my God, it's you. I know you through Twitter.
Yeah.
So it's another community. And I think trauma and acute care surgery, I'm biased. I think we have the greatest community of any surgical specialty. Just incredible people. And then you build this other community through social media. But you just have to realize that there are the downsides of it, and you can get called out for something, even though you didn't mean it that way. If you have a history of, inflammatory posts or questionable posts, like in college, that might be something you want to get rid of before you start hitting the job market. And I know some people who go through and purge their, a lot of their profile. I know some who have just deleted their entire profiles before they start interviewing. And then others who have said, I just don't want to deal with any of that. And I'm going to be on social media, but with an anonymous account. And I think all those approaches are reasonable.
All right, Dr. Pearl wants to know, how important is additional graduate education? For instance, would a master's in education or public health be useful for people wanting to go into academic fields?
I think a master's of public health can be helpful. Again, if your goal is epidemiologic research, I think a master's of education, if you are truly, I'm going down the educational pathway. I want to be a program director, and then, I want a career in education. Maybe I want to be a dean, associate dean. It can be helpful there. I'd say but in general, they are certainly not required for success in academic surgery.
Yeah, I'd agree. I do some surgical education research, and I will never be on par with a lot of the powerhouses in surgical education, but that's not my MO. That's not my prerogative. I'm happy where I'm at. But if you want to excel and you want to go far, then you might want to consider the master's. But I don't think it's a have to.
Yeah, I'd say most of the people who are educational leaders in academic surgery do not have a master's in education. So it's certainly not a requirement. And I think many of the master's surgeons will probably add little to somebody who's already an academic surgeon. And then the American College of Surgeons now has their in-house master educator program. You can go to their website and apply for that. And actually, I would weigh that more heavily than just a general master's of education.
Excellent. We have a question from Dr. Hassan Mashbari, asking how you can self-reflect, like, for example, 5 or 10 years into practice, and you want to reflect on whether you are within the expected progression of your career, or if you've fallen behind, especially if you're in a place where not many people are trained in your particular subspecialty to compare yourself with.
I think Dr. Martin's better suited to answer that. I'm not even 5 months into my career. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, one, I'd say, Hassan, I don't think he has to. I know Hassan. I don't think he has to worry about falling behind anybody. But I don't know. My gut reaction to that is almost, who cares? I don't gauge myself by kind of what somebody else is doing, and that's what I mentioned at the beginning. Define your own success. Define where you want your career to be going. Don't gauge it off of others. Gauge it off of your own goals. If you want to get a general sense of what others, who are similar to you are doing, and you're at a place where, you're some super subspecialist and you're the only one at your institution, then I think that's where, participating in your professional organizations or even on social media, where you can, get a better sense of that would be helpful. But I'd say, judge it by your own goals. And again, what brings you joy and what brings you not joy.
I will say that that is something I have learned even this early on, is trying to get out of the trainee mentality of being, you've kind of got this step ladder of where you're going next, and now being at the kind of the end of that trainee rung. You're only limited by what you want to do and what brings you joy and what you want to excel at, and you don't have to stay on par with anyone. You can go anywhere and do anything.
Question for Dr. Martin. When should salary be brought up during the interview process for your first job? During the second or follow-up interview, will it turn potential employers off?
Why do you say that's for Dr. Martin?
I just figured you'd have something to say about this.
I'm the money hungry salary one? Yeah, that's actually a great question. And I think It does differ a little bit by the type of job. In academic jobs where it's usually a couple interview process, my advice is just don't bring it up at all in the first round of interviews, and that should come up in second or third rounds. But also, if you know some people who work at that institution, who are friends of yours or good contacts, it's certainly something you could discuss with them offline. Some private jobs, though, where it's a one interview process and they're making a decision, then that's certainly something to bring up at the first interview. But I wouldn't open with that, and I wouldn't make that your primary concern of well, how much money am I going to make?
Okay, we've got
And Brittany went through that much more recently than I have.
Mhm. Yeah, actually, yes, I totally agree with that. I did not bring up money. I had heard the same thing, and they will bring it up. It's not like it won't get brought up. And really, I shared a little bit about it, but it is so true that there is way more to the job than salary. And there are way more things to be concerned about and to think about and to keep your mind open to. And I think actually not knowing the salary early on is good, to keep your eyes and ears open to other things that are really important too.
Speaking of other things that are really important, Brittany, I know we've discussed this a couple times in some of the group chats that we're both on. What about other things like expectations for call and things like that, and RVU expectations, and how do you navigate those things in your first potential job?
Yeah, I think, I mean, honestly, again, I think it really stinks, first of all, that you can't do all this in person this year and that it isn't live, because you can really gauge a lot of the culture and that sort of thing by being here. But at the very least, I would say if you're doing virtual interviews this year, make sure that you are asking not only to meet with the chair of the department, the trauma medical director, whatever, but meet with other people in other specialties, people who are at your same rank, people who have just come in, people who have been there for a while, and you'll be able to better gauge the sense of community and the culture by meeting with some other sporadic people who aren't just the cookie cutter ones that you have to meet with. And I think everyone's been doing this long enough. I would think you would be able to figure that out and navigate by the way that you ask the questions that you ask. So asking what the culture of cross coverage is like, what is it like if or giving maybe clinical scenarios. Okay, what if I'm in a level 1 trauma and I'm operating and another level 1 comes in? What's the culture like for managing that one? Is it that the senior residents are competent and autonomous enough to handle it while I go see the new one? Is it that I call someone else in? I think some of those clinical scenarios can kind of help open oh, well, just last week, this is what happened. And, oh, the culture here is to call XYZ. And that might be able to give you a little bit of insight by using a clinical scenario. That's kind of what I've done in the past.
Yeah, and those are important things you need to know about. I'd say one is gauge how important that is to your decision about taking that job. For example, if you're coming out of fellowship, your goal is to be clinically active. It really doesn't matter a whole lot to you if you take a lot of call. In fact, you want to take a lot of call, not a big issue. If you are coming out and you want to be on a research track and you want to get, a K award and you need dedicated time, then that should be something you discuss up front. What you don't want to do is come in and say, hey, listen, I want to do as little clinical call as possible. And what can you do for me? And the other thing I would suggest is most groups, no matter the configuration, will have some type of practice administrator, and ask to meet with that person. And that's probably the best person to bring up some of those discussions. And because that's what they do. I don't think it'll be looked at negatively as, when you meet with the chair and start off with, well,
Mhm.
what's the least number of call shifts, or, how many call shifts will I have to take? But that's the practice administrator's job. And they're usually more than happy to answer those questions for you and be very transparent about it.
So I think I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll get on to our final slide announcements. So Dr. Arafay says, thank you for this talk. I understand that you're not always going to be in agreement with your partners, and that sometimes we agree to disagree. Can you comment on how you can gauge future relationships with partners during an interview and the importance of that in joining a practice? Tough questions.
Oh, that's a great question.
Mhm.
You want to take that first?
Yeah, I mean, again, I've only been here a few months, but I think that gauging future relationships with your partners, I think it's kind of like a marriage in a way, in that you figure out what's important to those people, and everything else will kind of follow, because we're not going to agree on absolutely everything, on whether EMS report should be pre or post first set of vitals. We're not going to agree on whether the patient should have been diverted or not diverted every single time, every single way. So you're not going to be able to avoid disagreement and avoid conflict. But I think if you go to a place that is like-minded and they think the same things are important that you think are important. So for me, academics and being up to date and evidence-based was really important, and being in a place that fosters propelling young surgeons forward in their career. Those two things were really important to me. So if I'm landing at a place that is doing things evidence-based, then when we have disagreements, the way we're going to resolve those agreements is by going to the literature and looking about it and talking about it and a nice little academic discussion. So for me, it's finding commonalities, common things, and then your disagreements can be absolved by kind of looking backwards at those things that you find important and they find important.
Yeah, and I agree with all that. And again, when I showed you my top two things were, one, the group of people I was going to be working with when I was, and this was just two to 3 years ago when I got out of the military. So that was critical for me. I did not want to be part of a group, that does not get along and is at each other's throats. And so it's really important you try to get a good sense of that. I found one of the best ways is to talk to trainees at that program, talk to mid-levels. So, most of the programs now have PAs or NPs, and they'll often give you a great sense of, is this a happy program where people get along, or as we call some programs, is this an island of misfit toys? Uh, and then the other thing to look at is look at the turnover. Look at the turnover at that program in the last couple years, and if there's high turnover, that's another red flag. And also very helpful, if there has been a lot of turnover and somebody who left, talk to them, and they'll often be very candid with you. And maybe they left for new opportunity, maybe they left because of the toxic environment. And as I said, there's not enough salary in the world, at least for me, that would be worth going to work at a place where you just don't like the people you're working with, and the people don't get along.
Words of wisdom. Thank you very much.
Lots of wisdom.
So thank you both so much for participating in this virtual town hall. I know it's hard to take time out of your busy schedule as parents and surgeons and busy clinicians. So I want to thank you both very much, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. I want to take a quick minute to announce some of our upcoming events. Our next virtual town hall focus on the do's and don'ts and pearls for interviewing and finalizing an agreement will be on the week of November 16th, and the final virtual town hall in this series will occur in January after the virtual job fair, and will focus on negotiating your contract. And lastly, Please remember that the virtual job fair will go from December 3rd through the 5th, and we highly encourage your participation. For further information, you can visit the virtual job fair page on the AAST website at aast.org. Thanks again to everyone for participating. Thank you for the privilege of being able to moderate this outstanding session tonight. We look forward to seeing you for the next one. Good night, everyone.